Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Continuing How to Work with People from Swami's wonderful Art of Supportive Leadership book. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all. Help us to feel your guiding presence within us, that every decision we make, every action, every thought is permeated with the uplifting power of your consciousness. We are your children. Guide us, bless us, bring us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay, friends, we are continuing with this very interesting section in the book, chapter 7, which is called, let me get the title exactly right, Leadership is Intuition, that's good, Guided by Common Sense. And yesterday he was talking about asserting authority on the basis of everybody agrees with me and how really unwise that is. I'm summarizing it. You can go back and listen to it. An appeal to popular vote is not, of course, the sort that leaders are likely to make. This is a continuation of saying, you have to do it because everybody agrees with me, everybody feels like I do. My bosses agree with me. And then Swami was talking about how often when people make such vague claims, they just turn out to be not true at all. So he's saying here an appeal to popular vote, meaning to prove your point you're going to get everybody to vote and show that they're with you, is not the sort that leaders are likely to make. Those in authority are more likely, but just as unwisely, to lean on the approval of those with authority over them. Excuse me, I have to cough. He said that my voice is really just not wanting to be there today. Those in authority are more likely, but just as unwisely, to lean on the approval of those with authority over them. In this case, it is their superiors whom they represent poorly. What he's saying here, it's not that if you're second in command, you want to pretend that you're first in command. But if the only way you can get people to listen to you is say, well, the big boss says so, and you're just nothing but a mouthpiece, you're contributing no magnetic intelligence of your own. And people are following you only because you're using the name of the other person. It's hard to explain how depleting that is for those who are under you. I was in a position within the context of Ananda many decades ago where let's see, first one group was trying to assert decision-making power over me, and it was questionable enough whether they actually had authority or not. This was while Swami was still living. And then the secretary to those authorities started trying to assert authority over me on the basis of the fact that they worked for the ones who were asserting authority over me. And besides the fact that it was completely out of balance, the levels of responsibility, the assignments, it just wasn't appropriate for the secretary to someone else to be making decisions that were rightly my responsibility. But it was also, I just felt so helpless in the face of the whole thing, because there were lines of authority and everybody was muscling into those lines of authority. And it's not like I was interested in power, but I did feel that I should be allowed to make the decisions for my area of responsibility and not have them dictated to me 3 stages away. Swamiji's way of of organizing Ananda has always been to put as much responsibility as possible, as close to the situation as possible, instead of having someone at headquarters dictate what happens out in the field. He feels like the people who are out in the field, so to speak, should have as much authority as they can possibly handle effectively. So Swami got involved, and it was just a question of we ourselves trying to figure out what was appropriate. But I became very sensitive because of that experience, and I've done my best in the situation I'm in to not have people try to get their way by saying this is what Asha wants. It's like it's either a good idea or it isn't. And the mere fact that I might have suggested it, that we do it, it's either a good idea or it isn't. It's not made a good idea just because somebody in authority said so. It's a good idea if it is. And this is where a certain amount of common sense. But I'm saying that because I was on the receiving end of that, and I realized exactly what he's saying here. That you have to be very mindful of how you use position in order to progress your agenda. There are times, and Swami said there are times when you have to. I remember once when I was disputing something with Swamiji, and he was usually very patient, but he got a little tired of me. He said, Asha, sort of like that Asha, meaning like, listen to me. You always agree with me in the end. And he was right. You always agree with me in the end. So why don't you just be quiet for now and think about it? And it was just right. I do always agree with him in the end, so I needed to be quiet and think about it. Now, oh yes, that was a case, a rare case, where Swami simply asserted his authority. He did it truthfully and effectively, but that's what he was saying, which is, I'm in charge. You always end up understanding that I'm right, essentially, even though he didn't say it. Or you come to understand what I'm trying to accomplish, which would be more true. Sometimes I would miss the point of what he was trying to accomplish, then I would argue with him over the details, and then invariably, sometimes it took years, but invariably I would come to understand what he was doing and why he was doing it. It's a particular incident, those of you who know Ananda history, like more than 20 years ago, Swami wrote this document, which we always called the chanting letter, and it was about an inclination that was growing in the community to put too much emphasis on traditional Indian chants and not enough emphasis on the ones that Master had written. At that time, I was a great fan of those traditional Indian chants, and I chanted them often, and we had kirtans, and I really, really liked it. And I argued with Swami from every angle I could think of, and he was adamant. So we didn't cooperate fully, but we went in the direction that he wanted us to go. I have to honestly say, that letter came up because I was doing Swami's book of letters, Letters of Divine Friendship, and I went through every letter in the book. I just finished that class last week, and I came to that letter again. And there it was, more than 20 years later, I believe, at least that. And all of a sudden, it made perfect sense to me. And even since then, I've come to understand it a little better. That's 2 decades, I believe, of time, certainly many years. And I've cooperated, but all of a sudden, I finally actually understood. And I can't really express it clearly, and it's not the point here. But it was a very interesting experience for me. And Swami was adamant in his authority on that one. He listened to me, but he didn't feel that my arguments were more important than his. I couldn't comprehend his arguments fully. I understood them slightly, but not fully. But I had to go along with it because he was in charge and it was his responsibility. But these things, you see, are very complicated. And we ourselves as leaders keep learning. And we ourselves as devotees keep learning. So he said, in this case, It is those superiors whom you represent poorly, meaning if you're so insecure or incompetent in your position that all you can say is, the boss told me to say so, so I'm saying it, then you're also not representing them well, because you're using their authority to squelch dissent, and that's not necessarily what they would want to do. And that's one of the reasons why it distresses me when, in the past, I'm not in that position anymore, but in the past my name would be used in that way. Is that I wouldn't use my own name that way. So I don't really want other people to do it either. I don't want to be in a group, especially not a community like ours, where it's just a question of Asha says so. I mean, that was not anything I accepted. I don't know why I would want anyone else to accept it. People with spunk are not inclined to accept it. Then you want people with spunk who can really make things happen through their own energy. So moving right along, a junior officer ought to have the conviction, that's the right word, to win people by his own authority, which has been invested in him by his superiors. He should have the conviction. He should believe in what he's doing. He shouldn't just pass the buck upriver and just say, well, they want it, so we'll do it. That also subtly can very much undermine your team. Well, if he's only doing it because he said so, then like where is the clarity in this whole reality? He ought not to lean weakly on the mere fact that they have given him his authority. We have to, this is why I much prefer to think in terms of responsibility rather than position. But be respectful of lines of authority. It's exceedingly confusing in a group when the lines of authority get confused. That I'm representing the ultimate authority, and then you don't agree with me, and you go around me, and you get support from there, and then all of a sudden I'm completely neutralized. And I never know after that whether or not I'll be supported. This is what I was talking about yesterday, or the day before, the need for the one in charge to support the people that he puts in charge, or take them out of their position. The claim to have the support of others, conveniently absent, and therefore unable to represent themselves, or the endorsement of one's boss, also conveniently unavailable for comment, is nothing less than an attempt to close the door on any challenge to one's own authority. Oh my, this is so tempting. Sometimes you just want people to just go ahead and go forward. You don't want to keep having to hear what everyone's point of view is. And Swami does say later on in this book, there are times when, Swami puts it, any decision short of absolute madness is better than further discussion. So there are times, and Swami allows for it earlier in this chapter, when you do just have to say, well, I understand your point of view, but the decision is mine to make, and I'm making it. Because you have to balance. You have to balance giving people the right to speak with the fact that at a certain point you have to go forward. So it depends on who your team is. And there are people who like process. They prefer process to action. And when you have too many team members who prefer process to action, then you have to take a stand at a certain point. It's been sufficiently discussed, all points of view have been considered. This is the decision that we're going to go with now. I recognize that it might not be the perfect decision, but I feel that it's good enough, and we go forward. A good leader knows that nothing can really be gained by squelching his subordinates, even if, as is probable, he has had more experience, or is older, or does have the boss's support. He should demonstrate his right to his position of leadership either by appealing to sweet reason or by the sheer magnetism of his own conviction. That's a nice one, the sheer magnetism of his own conviction. That was how Swami would win me and many of us, even if we weren't sure or if we didn't quite agree. just that Swami's magnetism was so attractive. It wasn't that he used the magnetism over us. It was rather that it was so attractive that you preferred to just be cooperating with it than resisting it. A couple of projects particularly that I worked on for Swami in 1976. We set up the Bicentennial Liberty Committee, which was a political action group in Nevada County for the sake of getting the Board of Supervisors to follow the recommendation of the grand jury and fire the director of the planning department. And we took that up because it was a righteous cause. We took that up also because the incompetent director of the planning department was putting a seemingly insurmountable roadblock in the pathway of Ananda's very existence and any possibility of its future development. And Swami saw immediately that nothing was going to succeed except to get this incompetent woman removed. Swami was experienced enough with human nature to realize that our presence would expose her incompetency and she would fight for her survival to the end. And she had the power to do it because a bureaucracy can just keep obstructing. So we started this political action campaign, which a year later did get the incompetent planning director fired, a very competent person hired in her place, and that competent director led Ananda through the process, and we exist, Ananda Village exists today because of that. Swami is convinced that if we hadn't gotten her fired, and of course the grand jury had already recommended it, it wasn't like it was just our idea. Now all I'm saying about this is I had no idea what we were doing. I had no capacity to evaluate the situation with the clarity that Swamiji was able to evaluate it. Many of my peers thought it was a really terrible idea and that Swami had gone off the deep end with this one. But by the sheer attractive magnetism of Swami Kriyananda, I just wanted to be part of it. I didn't know what we were doing or why we were doing it or how it was going to work, but his magnetism was so delightful. And here we were. And he knew that that was how to win me. He didn't try to win me with the nobility of our cause, although of course I cared about that. He won me by the sheer magnetic joy of his aura and the power of just riding in that wake. And I just put aside all other considerations because that was the best. Sometimes when I think about Ananda especially, but it's a leadership principle, people should want to be in the company of the leader. They should feel like going along with you is a lot of fun, or uplifting, or noble, or exhilarating, but that there's the sheer magnetism of it is taking you. And that's not a question of position. That's a question of the reality of who you are. Sometimes in a group, interestingly, the actual leader might not have much position, but they're the ones with the magnetism. And that magnetism will pull everybody in. Alternatively, should he fail to win people by these means, he might do well to search for a compromise or to suggest some other solution that they will be able to understand and accept reasonably. So Swami says sometimes you really have to listen. Reality always wins. That's what we talked about yesterday. To just sort of say, well, there's some good ideas here. The whole project won't be lost. Let's see what I can appropriately give up. And see how detached the leader has to be from their own position, their own importance, their pride, their sense of being right. We just have to, what is reality here? If I'm not really going to be able to win them by reason or magnetism, how can we negotiate a solution where we can still go forward? Discriminating supporters need to be cultivated. Okay, that means you want people who know how to think. Otherwise, the darndest things happen. People just sort of blindly follow and do foolish things that if they were thinking for themselves, they wouldn't do. Or they allow you to come up with a bad idea when they have a better idea, when better ideas exist. Discriminating supporters need to be cultivated. People who have good judgment, who can think, who can analyze a situation, you want to encourage those people. Yes, they'll take more time, and you can't just issue orders. You're going to have to relate to them. But in the end, that's everything that you want. Their discrimination can be dulled if all they are ever asked to do is stand about applauding your sterling qualities. Swami's way of putting it, if all they're ever asked to do is stand around and applaud your sterling qualities. I don't know if Swami puts it in here or not, but a leader should be careful about allowing too much praise. You don't want to set up a culture in which the culture is everyone adores you. I mean, it's nice if they end up liking you, but you don't want to make a corporate culture in which you're being applauded as part of the story, and everybody tells everybody, is always gushing about how wonderful you are. I'm always very, very suspicious, and I think pretty much without exception, whenever people gush too much, sooner or later they turn against you. Because if they're exaggerated in their praise, their attitude is not entirely balanced. So you just, it's not a good thing when people laud you too much. You just have, I mean, that's not unequivocally true, but let me think about this. My regard for Swami is without limit, but I never buried him in praise because I knew he didn't like it, and it becomes, the word is, it loses its magnetism. Not everything is strengthened by being articulated. Sometimes, yes, you want to express gratitude as it is appropriate, but you don't want to encourage in others, and you don't want to encourage a culture in which too much praise is heaped on everyone. It also becomes a kind of terrible trap. I remember Swami had this point of view about, and I'm by no means saying you should never express appreciation. Sometimes when I've talked about this, it gets really twisted. Of course you express appreciation and gratitude. It's the sign of a refined nature to do so. But for example, when we have had a big event at Ananda Village, and then somebody starts thanking, we thank the kitchen staff, and we thank the guest program staff, and then we thank the housekeepers, and then we thank the teachers, and then we thank the workmen who put up the tent, and then we thank the babysitters who took care of the children. And on one hand it's great, but it's sort of, as soon as you start listing, then you have to be sure you list everyone, because why did we stop here and why did we not include them? And then Swami's comment was, and then you have to thank all the guests for coming, because if it wasn't for their enthusiastic presence, none of the whole thing would happen. And where do you stop? And it's not that we don't want to appreciate, but we want to celebrate together what we've done in a wonderful way. So it's something that you have to use discrimination on. And you want to make sure that your words have power. Swamiji was so appropriate. He was very supportive. He gave credit always where credit was due. He never tried to take credit where it didn't belong to him, never. But because he was appropriate, there was always power in what he said. Just a few words from him, they bore the entire nature of his consciousness. It wasn't just, oh, sweetie, you've done such a beautiful job. Once again, I just can't believe how inspiring. It's just like it sort of gets poured out, and just be conscious of it. Be conscious of it, how you use words like that, and be conscious of not setting up a situation where people are expected to stand around and applaud you all the time. It's very important. A handful of such supporters, discriminating supporters, are 1,000 times more valuable to any worthwhile undertaking than a veritable horde of blind followers and yes men. Swami always said, I prefer an honest argument to an unconsidered yes. That's how he put it. If someone just says yes because they always say yes, he'd much rather that you argued with him, which is why he accepted my arguing with him as much as I did, because I didn't do it. I wasn't just rebellious, and I didn't do it just to be negative. I was just shallow in my thinking, but I was sincere, and he knew it, and I was seeking a greater depth. And so when I would dispute, it was because I wanted to understand, not because I wanted to win. See, those are two different ways that people argue. I have mentioned the tendency to surround oneself. This is actually a whole nother idea that, well, I guess I have time. I have mentioned the tendency to surround oneself with an impenetrable mystique. There is another version of this tendency. It is the claim to some purely personal intuition. This is a claim by which people often seek to support views which they find themselves incapable of defending on rational grounds. I feel this to be true, is the usual expression, one that is met with universal exasperation, or I feel that you're all making a serious mistake. Leaders are by no means the only ones guilty of this ploy. Browbeaten subordinates may resort to it also, seeing it as their only defense against a leader whose technique of leadership is to overwhelm his subordinates. In fact, however, any argument that paralyzes reasonable discussion is an invitation to disaster. This is something, of course, that comes up in an ashram a great deal. I meditated and this is what I felt. Sometimes it goes even farther. This is what I felt Master tell me to do. Very, very interestingly, Swami almost never said, I'm doing this because Master told me to do it. But he never did anything unless Master told him to do it. Because if he said to us, Master told me to do it, what are we supposed to do if we don't agree? What are we supposed to do if we don't understand? I'm going to talk about this more tomorrow, but let me I'll close with this one story. A friend of mine many, many years ago took an unpopular decision, and there was a lot of kerfuffle about the decision that he was making. It had impacts on many people, many other people. And he came to me because he was a friend, and he said to me, I feel this is what God wants me to do. And I pleaded with him. I said, my dear friend, I believe that's how you feel. I believe you would not be taking this action unless you really felt deeply guided to do it. But many people don't agree. And it would be much easier going forward if they simply didn't agree with you. If they have to disagree with God, it puts them in a very, very difficult position. And you see, that's what happens. If you start with, God told me to do this, the Guru told me to do this. It's a very serious and tricky issue that needs more time than I have, so I'll take it up in our next session. God bless you.